Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Dermine. I am the Executive Director of the Pesticide Action Network Europe. We are a Brussels-based NGO covering the European Union with members across the EU. I see that we have a few present here today. Thank you very much for joining this meeting and for your interest in the topic of children's protection against pesticides. It is a topic that is very dear to us because indeed children are among the first victims of pesticide use. Of course, farmers are the victims, the environment, but also children for several reasons we will develop today. And we know that pesticides are toxic to human health, but even more toxic for children. And for instance, recently there was a ban, well, a few years ago already, on chlorpyrifos, which is an organophosphate insecticide that was used for decades and decades in the European Union and worldwide. But suddenly we discovered that it was seriously harming the unborn and newborn children, reducing children's IQ, and citizens have been exposed to this pesticide for a very long period of time. We also have some contradictions in the EU. For instance, pesticide residues in food for children, baby food, are extremely low by law. You basically cannot have pesticide residues in baby food. But the moment parents decide to cook themselves for their baby, then if they use non-organic fruits and vegetables, then babies are exposed to very, very high levels of pesticides that might harm them. We know also that babies and the unborn are very susceptible to endocrine disruptors. And food is the first source of exposure of endocrine disruptors, but also the use of pesticides in towns and direct exposure through agriculture. A recent report from UNICEF has been pointing out that in many European countries, the probability of the risk of exposure to pesticides is very high for up to 9% of the children. It is the case in particular in the Czech Republic, in Poland, Belgium, or the Netherlands, where more than 9% of children are at high risk of pesticide exposure, which is something we need to address and tackle. And of course, the first place where we would not like to be exposed to pesticides is in playgrounds in our hometowns. And now I will give the floor to my colleague Natalia, who has been organizing this webinar. Thank you very much, Natalia, in the frame of our Pesticide-Free Towns campaign. So Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for this introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to webinar Making European Cities a Safe Place for Children. At the beginning, I want to thank our speakers for preparing their interventions and all participants for showing interest in our webinar that focuses on health of children, more precisely on the impact of pesticides used in the maintenance of urban public spaces on children's health. Pesticide-Free Towns is a pan-Europe's campaign that invites cities and municipalities to protect the health of their citizens, as well as the nature and the environment, by banning the use of synthetic pesticides on public places, and even better, on its entire area, including private properties when possible. I wanted to say a few words about the current discussions around the proposal on sustainable use regulation, and in particular on parts on sensitive areas. So with this event, we want to stress what is happening in cities when pesticides are applied, what are the impacts on children and unborn children whose brain and actually all organs are developing intensively, and we want to explain why we ask in this regulation for large buffer zones, the adequate definition of the sensitive areas, why we ask for application of precautionary principle, as well as the addition of provisions related to health, so that the different ways of exposure to pesticides and also different routes of environmental contamination with pesticides will be addressed in this regulation, and that cumulative and synergistic effects of pesticides will be also taken into account. Children are small, but in relation to their body weight, they eat and drink more than adults. They breathe faster, their heart beat faster, and their metabolism is much faster than the one of an adult. Therefore, pesticide residues have more impact on children than to an adult person. For this reason, we invited researchers and scientists to tell us about the findings on pesticide residues in cities and about the impact of these toxins and the impact they have on growing and developing children's organisms. But not to have this webinar only focused on frightening facts, we also invited the city of Paris, the representatives of the city, to tell us how they have been successful in managing public places for several years without the use of synthetic pesticides. We will also inspire you with a presentation about the available political options for cities to advance to pesticide-free concept, and we will talk about children's rights. To conclude, children should not be the victims of inert systems that are taking easier ways. Children's well-being should always come as a priority, and where there is a danger, decisive actions must be taken. I give the word now back to Martin.
Thank you, Natalia. Just some housekeeping information before we start. Please also always make sure you are on mute, except if you're a speaker. Put your questions in the chat. We will try to address as many of them during the 30 minutes we have reserved for Q&As in the end. Please do not put comments in the chat and start debating in the chat. It will disturb everybody, just questions. And then for the speakers, 3 minutes before the end of your talk, I will remind you that you are coming to the end. And with that, I suggest we start with Violette Bernaux from the city of Paris. She is working with the Urban Ecology Agency of Paris on alternatives to pesticides in the frame of the French L'Abbé law that forbids the use of pesticides in public areas. Violette Bernaux, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, I'm also here with Erika again, who is working at for the Zero Phyto strategy for Paris here. So she will be able to answer some more technical questions, for example. Thank you to you, Pan Europe, for inviting us here.
Erika, sorry, Violette, could you please turn on your camera eventually?
Yes, actually, we have a problem. We can turn on here, but it will like cut and be weird in like a few seconds. So that's why, yeah, that's
no problem.
That thing. So, but we have a presentation, so that will be better.
Okay, very good.
I'm going to share the presentation here.
Yes, we can see it.
Can you see it? Again, I will put it. Yeah, perfect. Everyone can see it perfectly?
Yes, it works well.
So the city of Paris has been a pioneer in the fight against pesticide, and especially for the health of all, and especially children, because it's our subject today. Here it's what we will talk about today regarding what we've discussed around the city of Paris and the rule and the regulations. Even the fight against pesticides that is actually pushing outside of Paris for children's health, especially. Paris, if we can talk a bit about Paris, Paris is about 105 kilometers square. It has 2.2 million inhabitants, so it's a very dense city. But still, if you want, and we among the 50,000 civil servants working for Paris. Over 3,000 are dedicated to green spaces and environment, so it's a lot. And regarding some facts about green spaces and trees in Paris, we have 531 gardens, 20 cemeteries, 2 large woods, over 600,000 trees in Paris, a botanical garden, some green walls, and urban agriculture. So even if we're really dense, we have a lot of green spaces to handle, to manage, really. So here you can see the wide diversity of green spaces we have here. So green parks and gardens, obviously. We have some vineyards, some cemeteries. We have an horticultural school. We have woods, trees, orchids, botanical garden, and we have our old horticultural production centers for the plants we use in Paris. So because we have some national regulations that are dedicated to phytosanitary products, we will do a lot of, we'll talk a bit of those. In France, pesticides include biocide products that we are not working on here, and phytosanitary products, the plant protection products really, that we are working on. We have different types of phytosanitary products, the chemical ones and the non-chemical ones. Those includes biocontrol solutions, organic agriculture certified or compatible products, and low-risk plant protection products that are defined by EU regulation. We also have other solutions to protect plants, basically microorganisms or basic substances like vinegar. If we look a bit at the timelines, France began to work on the phyto aspects as early as 2008 with the first eco-phyto plan. The target was to decrease plant protection products use by 50% in agricultural and non-agricultural areas. As you may know, the EU also adopted a framework directive in 2009 on sustainable use of pesticides. In 2011, there was a decree, especially targeted as some specific sites with children to use to basically ban the plant production product use in schools, nursery, kindergartens, but also to place open to public, for example, or hosting or welcoming vulnerable people. The star law we can talk about is the label law, the famous one that was voted in 2014. And as of the 1st of January 2017, there were restrictions in the plant production product use for the state, local authorities, and public bodies. So, for example, the city of Paris. And as of the 1st of January 2019, there were restrictions in those for private individuals. And in the 1st of July of 2022, the label was extended by a decree to private and collective spaces. So basically, the whole area of Paris is now concerned almost by the label, including the cemeteries, etc. If we make a bit of a focus on the label ban basically the use, the ownership, and the purchase of plant production product, but only the chemical one. The non-chemical one can still be used. And there are some exceptions, especially when fighting quarantine organisms or for security reasons. You also have a bit the timeline again here. And if you fail to comply to the conditions of the law, you can be punishable by up to 6 months imprisonment and a fine of 150,000 euros at the maximum. But if we look back a bit to 2019, you can see that Paris already tried to regulate the pesticides, the phytosanitary products on the whole area of Paris with a decree defining a chemical plant production product use ban for the whole Parisian territory. Unfortunately, it was invalidated by the French State Council in January 2021, judging that this use was not in the jurisdiction of local authorities, but it's still pushed for an extension of the label. It had some kind of impact on the national level, because in the same year, the decree to extend the labello to everything was actually implemented. And Paris still had some policies within its Paris Biodiversity Master Plan to manage pesticides since 2012, and with an update in 2018. So what are we talking about when we say zero phyto strategy in Paris? Actually, zero phyto means zero chemical phytosanitary products. So we still use some other products that are non-chemical. So Paris has been very like a pioneer in the zero phyto, because it has been herbicide-free cemeteries since 2015 and garden and parks phyto-free since 2009, before the labello requirements. The zero phyto strategy in green spaces has been accompanied by a range of practices, so that's really important to highlight. Thanks to also support of eco-friendly management label. There also had been some changes in the public view of spontaneous flora in public spaces and cemeteries. That is very important to see differently. Those changing in management, they had a consequence on the use of the basically insecticides and among other beneficial impacts. You can see on the slide some examples of different type of managements used in the green spaces in Paris. For the view, like the changing view, you can see on this slide that here are some greening permits that were given to citizens to be able for them to green their some places in Paris, and you can see some spontaneous flora that was not really aligned and managed perfectly, and that was done by citizens. So basically, and without the use, of course, of chemical phytosanitary products. What can we say? You can see also on this slide all the aspects of the management without phytosanitary products, chemical ones, so mulching, ground covers, and also the spontaneous or planted grass cover on the footpaths of the city of Paris, Père Lachaise, that helped the gardeners to manage the zero phyto strategy. As another examples, you can see that Paris has been using in its greenhouses, in the botanical garden and the horticultural production centers, some microorganisms, so ladybird larvae, ladybirds on lacewing larvae, and you can see also some boxes used for dispersing them. Because we're here talking about children, Paris has been doing a lot of things regarding the greening and the communication about the greening the city. So basically, you can see this program that has been running since 2014, called An Orchid in My School. So basically, the goal was to plant orchid in schools in Paris. So it's since the beginning, we had 214 schools that now has an orchid in their school. Basically, it's just for pedagogical purpose rather than any production ones, but and of course it's managed without any phytosanitary products use.
3 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. We also talked about urban agricultures in Paris. Paris has a program called Pyrethroids that's enabled the installation of projects within the walls of Paris, but also a bit outside. We are currently at the season 5 of Pyrethroids program. And within the Pyrethroids toolbox, there is a fact-check information on phytosanitary products. And of course, we cannot, if you are including that program, you cannot use any chemical plant production products on those sites. You tell that Paris also has an impact outside of this rule, because Paris also have some action dedicated to sustainable food. So it has a strategy for sustainable food, and among that, it actually implemented a plan for sustainable food, and it's targeted especially at school canteens and other institutional catering, and it's about 30 million meals a year, so it's a lot. Among those goals, one of them is, for example, to have 75% of organic food in 2017 among those 30 million meals a year. So basically, having those organic meals means that there is no pesticides used outside for producing those producing that food, basically. So Paris has also put in place different tools to ensure that those goals are reached. For example, AgriParis is a new tool that will be implemented this year to have some kind of cooperation with Paris and other cities and other places to have some sustainable agriculture. So something about pesticides will be planned in these tools. We have so many things about sustainable food, but was not really the topic, but you were talking about children. So basically wanted to say also that we're doing some things in the canteens as well and outside of the walls of Paris. And thank you everyone for your attention. I hope you could basically understand us a bit and see that Paris has been doing a lot.
Yes, thank you very much, Violette and Erica. It was very interesting. Paris and also France as a whole is a front runner in terms of banning pesticides in public area. And it's very inspiring also for other EU member states. Apologies to everybody for what happened. It's the first time we have this kind of surprise. So let's move on and hopefully we can continue. We have now 10 minutes. We're running 10 minutes behind schedule. I hope you can stay a bit longer. So with that, I will give the floor now to my colleague, Kristine De Schamphelaere, who will talk about political opportunities to protect children's health in Europe. Kristine is an agricultural engineer. She has been doing research on water quality in 2 universities in Belgium, and she has joined Pan-Europe a few months ago to help us with the work on the reduction of pesticides in agriculture in cities. As well as working on the toxicity of pesticides on soil. So Kristine, thank you very much for being there. Kristine is a bit sick today. So thanks, Kristine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here at this interesting symposium. I will now share my screen and hopefully, nobody will join us unwanted.
Yes, we can see your presentation. Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think you still need to put full screen mode.
It's here, right?
It's on the bottom. I think it's the little screen, yeah, in the middle, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
No, the one from the left.
Sorry, here, yes. No.
No, the one on the right to the, yeah, this one. No, left.
This
yeah,
one.
I think so.
Yeah, normally it shows completely immediately.
You can stop and start again.
Yeah, but
Yes.
if you take display settings.
No share.
Can you start again? Try again, Kristine?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now and take display settings, and then you can change it there.
Sorry, where? I'm sorry. Normally it appears immediately full screen. Maybe here.
Yeah, like take the first one.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Perfect.
I still see here some. You see my full screen now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Yes. So I will give a bit more explanation on political opportunities to protect children across Europe. also mainly in framework of the current happenings regarding the work on the sustainable use of pesticides regulation. Sorry, there's still one thing here in my, in my way, okay. So I would like to start with the statement of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Hilal Elver, in 2017. And he also stated that it's possible to produce healthier, nutrient-rich foods with higher yields in the long term without polluting and exhausting environmental resources. And he concludes, sorry, and sorry, I can't see my full screen. Okay, now it's finally fine. My apologies. Then the UN Special Rapporteur on the implications for human rights on the environmental sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and wastes, Marcos Orellana, stated in 2021, also in a report he wrote, that it's very important to ensure that buffer zones are appropriately sized to protect people, waters, and sensitive areas from the serious risks and harms of pesticide spray drift. So his report also states that it's very important to enact safety measures to ensure adequate protection for pregnant women, children, and other vulnerable groups, particularly susceptible to pesticide exposure. It's also essential to create buffer zones around plantations and farms until we reach the time where pesticides are phased out completely to reduce pesticide exposure risks. It's also essential that the public receives the necessary information and that necessary measures are taken to protect the public. And it's further also essential to encourage farmers to adopt agroecological practices to enhance biodiversity and naturally suppress pests, and to adopt measures such as crop rotation, soil fertility management, and crop selection appropriate for local conditions. So this is to set the framework that also at UN level, these topics are very much stressed, and their importance also for the health of citizens. Then at the EU level in 2019, the Green Deal was proposed by the European Commission, and this Green Deal entails many different legislative frameworks to get to a more sustainable future for Europe. Some of the most important ones for the topic that we're working on are the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, both presented in 2020, and they both contain important goals for pesticide reductions in Europe. There's also the goal of preserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity, and currently the legislation process is also going on for the nature restoration law. So to quickly go over some of these most important strategies, so also the biodiversity strategy for 2030 states that we need to reduce the risk and use of chemical pesticides and the use and risk of more hazardous pesticides by 50% by 2030. And also, and this is really important, eliminate the use of chemical pesticides in sensitive areas. Also, the Farm to Fork strategy underlines this, that we need to reduce chemical pesticides by 50%. Then there's also the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Zero Pollution Action Plan, where it's also stressed that we need to go to a reduction of at least 50% by 2030. And there's also the Sustainable Chemical Strategy, which entails to fully implement provisions in place for pesticides regarding the maximal residue levels, the MRLs, and also the pesticides regulation and plant protection products regulation. Yeah, so I will quickly go through the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive. So this directive is there since 2009, and the implementation of, for example, integrated pest management was part of this directive, which had to be implemented from 2011 in member states. And for example, there's a recital then that's very much important for the reduction of pesticides in public areas. It's a recital 16, and it stresses among more that in places as public parks and gardens, sports and recreation grounds, school grounds and children's playgrounds, and also in the close vicinity of healthcare facilities, the risks from exposure to pesticide are high and should there be minimized or prohibited. And also in Article 12, this is stressed, and the SUTEN defines these specific areas as areas used by the general public or by vulnerable groups, but also, for example, protected areas in framework of the Water Framework Directive and Habitats and Bird Directives. So now the process is going on to develop the sustainable use of pesticides regulation. So this means that the sustainable use of pesticides directive will become a regulation, which means that it will be legally binding and directly to implement by member states. So it doesn't have to be translated into legislation in the member states, which will hopefully, or that's the intention, really effectively implement integrated pest management in member states and reduction goals for pesticides. There's also the ECI, the European Citizens Initiatives on Safe Bees and Farmers, that calls for even stronger reductions of synthetic pesticides by 2030, 80% and 100% by 2035. While also asking for 100% reduction of more hazardous pesticides by 2030. So currently this process is going on. There was first a proposal by the European Commission, and now there has been a report by the rapporteur of the ENVI committee, on which currently amendments have been tabled on these proposals. And the voting will be in the coming months in the ENVI committee and in the Agri committee, and then later on there is a plenary after which the trilogue conversations will start on this regulation. So important is, as I said, the full implementation of IPM and these reduction goals. And I will now go a bit further into the sensitive areas and buffers, as that's most relevant for today's topics. So the sensitive areas are defined in the proposal of the SUR as areas used by the general public, predominantly by a vulnerable group, human settlements, so communities in which people live and work, urban areas covered by a watercourse or water feature, also non-productive areas and ecologically sensitive areas, which entail areas protected under the Water Framework Directive, but also under the Birds and Habitats Directive, for example, and also regional or national protected areas. So in the proposal of the European Commission, the use of pesticides would be prohibited in sensitive areas. So amendments suggested on this also entail certain exceptions by derogations, for example, then for low-risk pesticides. So this process is still going on, what the exact, the final regulation will say. And on buffer zones, the original proposal stated 3 meters around sensitive areas, but that member states may also establish larger buffer zones. And this is, according to Pan-Europe and many other organizations, way too little to be protective for citizens and for nature. So we propose at least 100 meter around sensitive areas, but it's also very important, and that is now not in the proposal, that also houses and private properties and gardens, that they also need buffers, as well as roads and paths, because of course citizens and certainly also vulnerable groups spend most time or a lot of their time at their homes, so they also need adequate protection there. And we also propose at least 25 meter in between fields. And just because this topic on buffers is important, and quite some studies, but also court cases point out the strong need for larger buffer zones. I will just quickly say, so what we proposed in the also in our amendments is an extensive recital on health, two actually, one on the right to unhealthy environments, and another going into the science, which science is available on the health impacts of pesticides, as that was not yet clearly in there. And yes, okay, so different court cases point out that at least that actually hundreds or even to some kilometers of buffers would actually be needed to protect from drift. So in France, there has been a court case in the Netherlands, but also now in Belgium. And in Belgium, for example, this court case is also exactly on these buffers around, also around houses, but other and public areas and zones frequently, frequented by sensitive groups. But they're also asking for example, a 2-kilometer buffer around nature areas, based on scientific studies that show that insects are affected that far from the application locations of pesticides. Yes, okay, I was gonna go.
All right. Thank you very much.
No.
And sorry that the technical problems did not allow you to present all the slides. But indeed, it's really important, the developments taking place now at EU level, the discussions between the Parliament and the Member States on the future of this proposal from the Commission to ban pesticides in public areas and sensitive areas.
Yes.
Now the next speaker will be Suzanne Astic from CRIN. So Suzanne is a lawyer by training, and she will talk about children's rights and pesticide pollution. If I'm not mistaken, CRIN has opened an office in what is increasing its activities at EU level, which is really, really nice. So Suzanne, the floor is yours. You also have 15 minutes, like everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see it in full screen mode?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. So I hope it will work well. Thanks a lot for the invitation and the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Pan Europe, for organizing the event. So I'm Suzanne Astic. I'm part of a Child Rights International Network. And just maybe before jumping into the presentation, pesticides pollution and children's rights, just wanted to give you a few words on the work CRIN is actually conducting in the EU level, but also internationally. So we are a creative think tank. We are working on human rights with a focus on children and young people. And at CRIN, we really believe that children deserve to have their rights fully recognized and respected. That's why we want to provide a children's rights perspective on environmental and health issues, and that includes pesticides. So we really work to encourage EU decision makers, but also member states authorities, national authorities, cities, regions, to think better about children's rights when it comes to policies on chemical safety. So today we'll provide you with an overview of both the United Nations and the EU framework that are protecting children's rights, but also how these rights are being impacted by the daily exposure to pesticides. Before jumping to the next slide, just wanted to mention that all the illustrations you will see throughout the presentation are made by our art illustrator at CRIN, Mirja Sugranis. So on this introductory slide, I won't extend too much and elaborate too much for the sake of timekeeping, because I know all the other panelists will dive much more into the details. So just wanted to remind what is at stake exactly when we talk about vulnerability of children that are being impacted by pesticide exposure. Of course, all humans are being exposed, unfortunately, to harmful substances, including pesticides, both adults and children. But for many reasons, many factors and drivers, children are much more exposed and vulnerable to these substances. So you can see on the slides, because of several factors, developmental vulnerability, also they submitted to exceeding intake, As Natalia mentioned in their introductory remark, they consume much more food and water relative to their body weight, so they absorb more toxics on a daily basis. Just wanted also to draw attention on the behavioral habits, because we know that children, they want to play on the ground, in water courses, you know, they are exploring the physical world through touch and taste, so they are really much more exposed throughout the behavioral patterns they are adopting. The risk is also that they actually are less able to evaluate the hazards and the risk they are exposed to. For instance, they are, on account of their age, they cannot read the labels, they cannot understand the warnings, for instance, and it's difficult for them to really adopt protecting behaviors. Finally, and as many studies and testing campaigns flagged and found, we see a recurrent presence of pesticides in public areas, and especially in areas where children are inclined to develop, have recreational activities, such as playgrounds and public parks. So we see that children suffer from higher levels of exposure, but they're also more sensitive to it, which makes them much more vulnerable than adults. And the exposure to pesticides significantly impacts fetal growth and fetal development, with long-term aftermath on birth outcome, but also on children development and eventually on their life and their health as adults. And those impacts have been internationally recognized at the UN level and the EU level. So I just wanted to provide you with an overview on many, some of the reports that have been published and drafted by the UN Special Rapporteur, but are particularly relevant to recognizing the impact of pesticides on children and the fetus. So there was a really key report, joint report in 2017 on pesticides, drafted by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. This report is really relevant insofar as it acknowledges that children are much more vulnerable to pesticides contamination because of a really small body. They are submitted to higher dose per unit of body weight. Really importantly, the report also highlights that the exposure to even really low levels of pesticides, for instance, through rain drift or residues of food on food, may be really damaging to children's health. So here we can really question the argument that the dose makes a poison, because in many cases, for instance, when we have endocrine disrupting chemicals, which is the case for several pesticides, actually, even at really low dose, these kind of substances can be extremely harmful for children. The report also highlighted the impact on pregnant women who are exposed to pesticides. They face higher risk of miscarriage, preterm delivery, and birth defects. This report echoed a report that was published in 2016 by the former rapporteur on toxic and human rights, Vashkun Tunkat. In this report, it really flagged some relevant and crucial points. First of all, that exposure starts before birth through the mother's own exposure. And it came with this really important wording of children being pre-polluted. So they're actually suffering, even at the prenatal stage, from a silent pandemic. They are submitted to daily exposure, even in the mother womb, to hazardous substances, including pesticides. And the impact can be irreversible, as recognized by the Special Rapporteur, and can be even passed down from generation to the other. So we see that children are exposed daily to hazardous substances, and including in the EU, actually. So the harmful exposure violates a wide range of children's rights guaranteed both internationally and at the EU level. So in this slide, just wanted to give you an overview also on which rights can be affected by the exposure to pesticides. And the cornerstone convention in that regard is the UN Convention on the Right of a Child. So of course it enshrines several in a wide range of rights, human rights for children. So you have, of course, the right to life. You also have the right to higher sustainable standards of health and to develop as persons to the maximum extent possible. The convention also guarantees the right to education, to recreation and play, and the right to information, which are particularly relevant when we think about children exploring in public areas such as playground or schoolyards. There is also the right to physical integrity, which is extremely interesting regarding to chemical exposure, because the physical integrity means the right of a person to participate in and make decisions about his or her own body. And really interestingly, the special rapporteur on toxic explained that the human exposure to toxic substances constitute an intrusion, no matter whether it's an acute poisoning or even a really low level of exposure. So it actually constitutes a human rights violation. There is also the children's rights to be heard, which is actually extremely relevant when it comes about exposure to pesticides, because the special rapporteur mentioned is closely linked to the question of consent and with the phenomenon of children being pre-polluted. He recommended that states should prevent childhood exposure in recognition of the rights of present and future generations to be heard. Finally, stemming from this convention, there is also an obligation for the states to really prioritize child best interests when designing environmental and public health norms, and ensure also their access to information and effective remedy. The convention is not the only international law instrument that exists. We saw over the years many reports, as you can see on the slides. I just mentioned a few. Also, we had in 2020 a report from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, which recommended the states must prevent childhood exposure to toxics in order to prevent children's right to life, survival, development, health, and bodily integrity. Similarly, in 2020, we had the Human Rights Council resolution on the realization of the rights of a child through a healthy environment. It urged the states to ensure the right of a child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. It includes, in terms of action, identifying and eliminating sources of exposure of children to substances of very high concern. And it took the example of endocrine disrupting chemicals, so that can apply to several pesticides once again. Finally, we had a really groundbreaking resolution that has been adopted quite recently. Probably heard of it already. It's UN General Assembly resolution on the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it called on both the states and the businesses to really scale up the efforts to ensure a healthy environment for all. And quite relevantly, it flagged that non-sound management of chemicals really interferes with the enjoyment of a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. So we can see here from all these reports, the convention, etc., that virtually all the world's governments have recognized that children have a right to the highest attainable standard of health. And the EU and the member states committed to respect those standards transposed in EU and national levels. The EU pledged to go even further, actually, with a Green Deal that has been presented by Kristine, and also with the EU strategy on the right of a child. So just wanted to briefly mention this European Child Rights Framework, as it's extremely relevant, especially in light of the ongoing revision of the sustainable use of pesticide regulation. So first of all, we can mention the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union. It's really important to remind that this charter is binding. It was introduced by the Treaty of Lisbon. So as such, it really binds all the EU member states with the same legal value as the EU treaties. And really importantly, the Article 24 guarantees and protects the rights and the best of interest of a child. That means that in all actions relating to children, whether taken by public authorities, which is extremely relevant for national authorities such as cities and mayors, or even for a private institution, the child best interest must be a primary consideration. Furthermore, this charter also guarantees the right to life in Article 2, and it prescribes environmental protection in Article 37. So we can see that children are fully subject of and entitled to these rights the EU and the member states committed to protect. They really committed to always take a child best interest into primary consideration. However, we can see that a wide range of pesticides that are particularly harmful to children are still being placed on the EU markets, and they can still be found in playgrounds and in other public areas. Another aspect that is really important when it comes about the European Children's Rights Framework is the recently published EU strategy on the right of a child. It was published in March 2021. It's quite a far-reaching and really interesting strategy because it's a right-based strategy, and it's really an instrument for all EU policies for mainstreaming children's rights perspective in all relevant policies, legislation, as well as in funding programs. And the strategy actually directly refers to the UN Convention on the Right of the Child. And over the years, at several occasions, the European Commissions recognized that the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child really guides the work of the Commission. And this strategy, the EU strategy on the right of the child, is anchored in it and is also building on the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. So the discussions on pesticides in urban areas and in a lot of sensitive areas, public areas, should really be seen particularly in that legal framework, in that legal context. And under this EU strategy on the right of the child, so maybe for the sake of timekeeping, I will conclude here just with a few remarks. What we can see here stemming from the presentation today is that really we have the ambition in the EU to build the best possible life for children in the European Union, but also globally. And at CRIN, we really want to raise awareness of EU and national decision makers on the need to pay specific and particular attention to children's exposure to harmful chemicals, such as pesticides. For us, we consider it's really crucial when drafting and implementing EU policies, such as the Farm to Fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy, and now the sustainable use of pesticides regulation, to really take into consideration this human rights, children's rights approach. And we really believe that the UN and the EU child rights frameworks, as are presented today, it's a key compass to really orient and guide the decision-making at the EU level, but also within the member states, in the member states level, including for drafting action plan and implementing those action plans in cities to ban pesticides and ensuring pesticide-free public areas. So I will stop here. Thanks a lot for listening to this presentation. If you have any question, I remain available, and you can find more information on CRIN's work on this area on our website, and also we offer more illustration available through the art exhibition available online. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you for this very interesting presentation and for CRIN's actions to better protect children against pesticides. We will move now to another topic, which is also highly related to direct exposure and its impact, is with Koen Hertogge. Koen is the president of Pan Europe. He is an activist in South Tyrol, so the German-speaking community of the north of Italy. Since 10 years, he's been active on pesticides in an area where the level of exposure is very high. And he has been one of the founders of a citizens' initiative in this town of Mals. Koen has also contributed to 4 peer-reviewed scientific publications on this topic. Koen, we cannot yet see you, but the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Just one check. I was just want to know if everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Natalia, do you have my presentation? Can you start my presentation, please?
Yes, I'm doing it now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for having me in this conference. It's been very interesting to hear the other speakers so far, and I think my part is going to add something, an additional value to what we have already heard. So as Martin said, I've been working for 10 years on pesticides. I've been doing 4 studies, and I'm going to present 3 of them very shortly. The studies are related to the contamination of public playgrounds in South Tyrol. If we can go to the the second slide, please. So we have done 3 studies in South Tyrol, which is the northern part of Italy. These studies have been done in cooperation with leading European scientists and other NGOs. Basically, in these studies, we have been taking grass samples on non-target areas, mainly playgrounds. And we have particularly chosen the playgrounds because they are foreseen in the Sustainable Use Regulation, Sustainable Use Directive, as sensible zones that need special protection, especially for the children. We have taken raw samples on these playgrounds, and we have analyzed them on pesticide residues. Up to 300 active substances were analyzed. And the area is mainly apple and wine production. About 50% of the apples produced in South Tyrol are put on the market in Italy, 10% on the European market, and 2% on the world production. The samples have been taken on playgrounds close to agriculture fields. On the next slide, we can see the cooperation partners. We have been working with HEAL, with Pan-Europe, and also with leading universities and also leading research institutions such as Ramazzini, and then also with some NGOs. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the first study was called Pesticide Contamination and Associated Risk Factors at Public Playgrounds close to the apple and wine orchards. Next slide, please. On the next slide, you can see the study setup, what we have been doing. That was done in 2017. We have taken 71 grass samples on playgrounds, and we screened them for 315 different substances. The grass samples were taken by authorized people, and they were analyzed in the official laboratory of the South Tyrolean government. We have divided the area in 4 different geographical clusters, and we have also divided between far and near. That means if the playground was within 50 meters of a agriculture field, we called it near, and if it's been more than 50 meters, that was far. The main result is that 50% of the grass samples were contaminated with residues of pesticides, mainly phosmet and fluocinam. And we found out that 11 out of the 12 detected pesticides were considered EDC, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And we found this very worrisome because, as we all know, these the concentration of the EDCs is not correlated to the health. So even a small concentration can also mean a big health issue for children, especially for the children who are playing on the playgrounds. What we did in the study is we did not say it's the agriculture who's causing the issues, because we know that there are a different sort of contamination coming also from other sources. But if we see that the majority of these pesticides that we found are mainly allowed to be used in agriculture, we can say that it's most probably coming from agriculture. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the next study, which was called the Year on Pesticide Contamination. In this study, we have not only taken a sample on a particular moment, but we reanalyzed samples that were taken by the regional government in South Tyrol, and we had this published in 2021. If we look at the next slide, I can tell you a little bit about the study setup and the results. As I said, we have reanalyzed the results from the regional government. So we have received the official reports, and we have seen that there were 33 different substances were found in 96% of the playgrounds. That means in 1 year we have 4 times we have analyzed 24 different playgrounds. So we have done something in spring, in summer, in autumn, and in winter. And when we say 96% of the playgrounds were contaminated, that means that only 1 playground was not contaminated during that year. About 80% of the analysis showed that the samples were contaminated with more than 1 residue, and 76% of these substances were EDCs. As you can see, the majority of the contamination is in spring. We saw 83% of the playgrounds that were analyzed were contaminated in spring, about 80% in summer, 50% in fall or in autumn, and 17% in winter. That means even in a period where there's no spraying, we can see that the playgrounds are contaminated. Obviously, the number of residues, the concentration, and the proportion of contaminated sites varied across the different seasons. What I would like to point out additionally is that we had one playground was contaminated with 11 different substances. And in this respect, it's very important to point out that the cocktail effect of these different substances, we know that from scientific point of view, there's not a lot of studies done on the cocktail effect. As a conclusion of the second study, we can conclude that the people living in South Tyrol or in the area where apple production is taking place, they are contaminated over the course of a whole year. And this is especially worrisome because we can see that, especially in South Tyrol, if you know the area, it's the agriculture fields and the playgrounds and the villages, they are all next to each other. Sometimes there's even only a distance of 5 meters between a private house and an agriculture field.
You have 2 minutes left, Koen.
Oh, okay, cool. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the last study that I would like to present, and I think that should be able to work. So pesticide drift measures appear to reduce contamination, but the hazard remains. So in this study, we have reanalyzed all grass samples that were taken between 2014 and 2020. A part of the samples were taken by the NGO, and a part of the samples were coming from the regional government. We found out that as I said, we analyzed for 300 substances, and the results, if you go to the key findings, that's more important. We have seen that 73% of the sample sites had at least one residue, and 27% had multiple residues. As you can see, we had found again fluacinon, captan, and phosmet. I think you all know what these substances mean. They can cause harm to the human reproduction. They can cause harm to certain organs. We have the EDC issues. We have the cancer risk that is stable during the whole period. And we have seen that even some of the substances get even worse. And then if we would have found these substances on lettuce, it would not have been possible to sell this salad or the lettuce in a shop, as it would exceed the maximum residue levels. As a small side remark, and then it's already the end, Martin, last year we have also taken lettuce samples. So we went to private garden and we looked for salad, and we found out that also DDT can still be found even 50 years after DDT has been banned in the European Union. Then my final remark is that if you see on the next slide, we believe that there's still a lot of improvement to be done on the sustainable use regulation, especially to be in line with the European Citizen Initiative. And we believe that there should be more bans in and around sensitive zones, especially on the playgrounds. And this idea has been supported by the UN Special Rapporteur Marcos Oliano, who published a report last year on Italy, stating that there is indeed an issue in South Tyrol with the playgrounds and the contamination. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, I am available, most probably per email. So any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me or via the organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koen, for your interesting presentation full of statistics and data. And thanks for sticking to the time. Our next speaker, so I see there are some questions in the chat. We will take time after the presentations to address them. So the next speaker is Alisa Hufsky. She's working for Bündnis für eine enkeltaugliche Landwirtschaft, and we'll talk about pesticide pollution in the air, which is a very important topic because currently in the EU there is no form of risk assessment of the toxicity of pesticide exposure through inhalation, even though we know that it is a major source of chemical exposure. Thank you, Alisa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. So I will start with sharing the presentation. Just 1 second. What, can you see it all?
Yes.
Perfect. So I will start. So yeah, I'm Alisa Hufsky from the Bündnis für eine enkeltaugliche Landwirtschaft. Well done for pronouncing it, Marta. And so we're an association of over residues. And we found glyphosate in 99.6% of the sample. So nearly all participants had glyphosate in their body. The highest concentrations were actually found in children and teenagers. And so we asked ourselves, how does glyphosate get into our body? We could rule out that it was through tap water, because actually in 80% of the samples, the residues that we found were 5 to 20 times higher than the maximum residue limit for drinking water. And we could also rule out that it was ingested via food, because over half of the participants stated that they only ate organic foods. And we found that there was very little difference in the results between the organic and non-organic eaters. And so this then led us to the suspicion that pesticides might be in our air. And this suspicion was then confirmed in 2018 when we did a tree bark monitoring of 47 trees, and we found over 100 different pesticide residues. And this then finally led us to our extensive study on atmospheric transport of pesticides, which we published in 2021 and will introduce to you today. So, as I just mentioned, our study is the most comprehensive data set done on this subject in Germany so far. We analysed over 163 sampling sites across Germany for pesticide residues. The sites included non-protected areas such as agricultural areas and private gardens, protected areas such as national parks and nature reserves, as well as cities. We used 4 different sampling methods. So the Team Institute who carried out the study developed special passive air samplers for the study using 2 different filters, one to detect glyphosate, a non-volatile substance, and one to detect volatile and semi-volatile pesticides. We also included 20 filter mats from ventilation systems from houses, and we also included 41 honeybee bread samples and 6 tree bark samples, as well as the 47 tree bark samples from the previous monitoring that we did in 2018. So this gave us a total of 163 samples, which were analysed for the presence of over 500 different pesticides and their related substances, such as degradation products. Now, before talking about the results of the study, I'd like to briefly explain the 2 different types of atmospheric transport we're talking about. So when we talk about atmospheric transport, we talk about pesticide drift as well as long-range transport. So pesticide drift happens during or shortly after application, when the wind blows the pesticide droplets or mist onto nearby areas. So it generally tends to be shorter distances, whereas long-range transport is when the active substances rise up into higher atmospheric layers due to ground warming. So this can either happen as aerosols for volatile and semi-volatile pesticides, or because they stick to dust particles, as is the case for glyphosate. And because of this, they can be transported for much longer distances. Now, if we look at the results, we found 138 different pesticides and related substances in total. We found cocktails of multiple pesticides at nearly every site, so up to 33 different substances in some cases. Glyphosate was actually found in every single passive air sampler and every single filter mat. And this is particularly worrying because glyphosate is a non-volatile substance, and so its atmospheric transport was ruled out in the approval of the substance. And 30% of the substances that we found were actually not approved for use in Germany. So either they were never approved in the first place, or they got banned a long time ago, which is the case for DDT, which we actually found in a lot of samples. And so if we look at where the pesticides were found in relation to their nearest potential source of outbringing, we found that whether the sampling site was close to a potential source or not only had a really small effect on the number of pesticides we found, which again indicates the long-range transport. So for instance, at even very remote areas such as the top of the mountain Brocken in the middle of the National Park Harz in Germany, we found 12 different pesticides. And equally, we found pesticides in the middle of city centres, which brings us to the next point. So although cities weren't the main focus of our study, we did take samples in 8 different towns and cities across Germany. So I've highlighted the places where where the sampling site was in the city centre in a darker blue, and the cities where the samples were taken on the outskirts of the city in a lighter blue. But as you can see, we found residues of multiple pesticides in all 8 cities where we tested. And the highest number of pesticides in a city centre location was actually found in Berlin, so the capital city of Germany. So if we zoom in on Berlin, in Berlin, we had a passive air sampler placed right in the city centre, as well as 2 honeybee bred samples. And in total, we detected 18 different pesticides in the centre of Berlin, including herbicides such as glyphosate, metolachlor, prosulfocarb, pendimethalin, terbutatrine, and terbutalicin. And we also found some already banned pesticides such as chlorophenol, which has been banned in the EU since 2004, as well as 2 of the main metabolites of DDT, which has been banned since the 70s. And so this just shows that unlike what is commonly believed, pesticides don't stay on the field where they've been applied, but they can travel long distances via air and can be found far away from their original source of outbringing, such as cities and nature reserves. And it's unlikely that there's actually any sites without pesticides in the air in Germany. And the impacts of pesticides in the air, and especially of pesticide cocktails in our air, on human health and the environment are largely unknown. So we have no idea what effects pesticides in our air have on our lungs, as current approval systems only take into account the absorption of pesticides via the gastrointestinal tract and not via lungs. And also there's no research done on the potential chemical interactions of pesticides and other air pollutants such as vehicle or industrial emissions. So this is particularly relevant for cities, as we have no idea what impacts that might have on human health and our lungs. So if pesticides are everywhere in our air and there's literally no way to escape them, what can we do? So on an individual level, we can make sure that we don't use pesticides in our own garden. We can buy organic products to support an agriculture that doesn't use synthetic pesticides in the first place. But there's also a lot that needs to happen on a political level. So we need more studies on the health and environmental implications of pesticides in the air, and the atmospheric transport of pesticide needs to be considered in the approval process of substances. We need yearly monitorings to track the atmospheric transport of pesticides, and the most commonly found substances in our study, which are glyphosate, pendimethalin, prosulfocarb, S-metolachlor, and terbutalicin, need to be banned immediately. So thank you for your attention. You can find out more about us and our study on our website here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alisa, for this very interesting presentation and sticking to the time. I see there are more questions in the chat. It would be very good to please stay until the end to be able to address the questions. And please, as a reminder, the chat is there just to ask questions, not to start debates. Otherwise, it will disturb both the speakers and the audience. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Mariana Fernández from the University of Granada. Mariana Fernández has a PhD in chemical sciences, and she will talk to us today about exposure to pyrethroids and developmental neurotoxicity. Ms. Fernández, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to start just saying thank you for the invitation to this webinar. I will present some of the studies that we had been done in our group in the University of Granada, and the reason why we are doing this kind of research. First, I will try to share my presentation, and please let me know if you are able to, just a minute to put it in a.
We see it not yet in full screen.
Okay.
Can you put it in full screen mode, please?
It's coming. It's take a few seconds. Can you
Yes.
see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we started this kind of research because probably you don't know that Spain occupies one of the first place in the consumption and use of pesticides among the European countries, as you can see in the slide. And we wanted to know how was the exposure to this contaminant among Spanish population, general Spanish population. To do that, we belong to a very large bird cohort, Spanish bird cohort. It's called IDMA, a child and environment bird cohort that is taking place in 7 different regions of our country, as you can see, in Asturias, Guipúzcoa, Sabadell, Ribera del Ebro, Menorca, Valencia, and also in Granada. The IDMA project compromised more than 4,000 mother-child pair recruited at the beginning when the mother is pregnant and is still following the child. That the oldest one are not anymore child, are already adult. They have 25 years. The objective of the IDMA Spanish bird cohort was to study the role of the most important environmental pollutant in air, water, and diet during pregnancy. As you already say, the mother were recruited when they were pregnant, and also in the early life, and obviously the effect on the child growth and development. Among the contaminants, as I already say, we were very interested in the exposure to non-persistent pesticides. The pesticide, I am not going to repeat what the previous speaker already presented, are one of the prioritized chemicals of concern because the relation to the very different aspects of human health. In our study, we choose the family of the organophosphates, measuring in urine sample some of the metabolites, the TCP and the IMP, that is a metabolite of the malation diacid compound, and also the DEATP, that is another metabolite of the organophosphate family. Regarding pyrethroids, we choose the most general metabolite representing this family, the 3-PVA. We also measure one of the metabolites of the carbaryl, the 1-naphtol compound, and also we include the EBC and the its metabolite, that is the ETU compound. We have already measured the presence of several of these compounds in 1,500 of the Spanish children population in the IDMA cohort from the different regions that I already commented. As you can see, we can find that most of the Spanish population, most of the children in our country are exposed not only to one of the compounds, including in the selection, but a few of them. So we need to think about that and not consider one specific compound, instead to see if the cocktail exposure could be related in a more real way instead one specific compound. In general, the concentration of the several of the compounds were within the range previously reported in other European countries, but in some cases, some of the metabolites were in a higher concentration and others in lower concentration. When we went to the frequency of detection, as you can see, some of the compounds were more detected than others, even though the main chemical parent compound was already prohibited in the European Union, as you can see, for example, in the case of chlorpyrifos. For example, when we see this specific metabolite, that is the TCP, a specific metabolite of chlorpyrifos, was really present in the Valencia area. And probably most of you already know, Valencia is a region where in Spain we produce a lot of orange and lemon, and we have a lot of citrus tree. In that specific region, the concentration and the frequency of detection of this specific metabolite was higher compared to the other region of the country. Among the most worrying health problems today in today's society linking to the exposure to this environmental compound, neurodevelopment occupies probably one of the most relevant positions, since its consequence range from a new quality of life of the individual to the worldwide of the whole society is very is of the major interest. The incidence, for example, of disorders such as attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, or even autism spectrum disorder is increasing worldwide among the a decrease in the intelligence coefficient. So it's even estimated that more than 70% of this incidence, of this effect, could be associated with environmental factors. But the problem is that it's not easy to establish a relationship between exposure to a chemical compound to a specific health problem. And still we have a lot of gap of knowledge, and it's difficult to understand the whole process, how the chemical, how the environment component target a specific organ of the human being. And in that sense, we wanted to include in our research hypothesis not only the biomarker of exposure and the outcome, we wanted to include some intermediate data that could have helped to understand the whole mechanism of action of this contaminant. This is quite inside the European project, the Human Biomonitoring for You project. We selected some effect biomarker, trying to understand if we could put it some key event between the exposure and the effect. Related with neurodevelopment, the brain-divided neurotrophic factor could be an adequate biomarker of effect candidate. Why? Because this biomarker regulates synaptic plasticity and plays a role in the neurodevelopment, and its alteration has been related with clinical pathology, as for example, bipolar syndrome, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, or depression. And most important thing, the peripheral BDNF level correlate with central level and are age and sex dependent. So for that reason, this marker could be a good indicator of the state of the central nervous system as well as the individual. With that introduction background, our main objective was to investigate the relationship between exposure to several non-persistent pesticides, BDNF as effect biomarker, and behavioral function among the Spanish adolescent male, because we wanted to start in our own cohort, in my Granada cohort is integrated in the whole Spanish cohort, in a way to start like a pilot study and to validate somehow this effect biomarker in order to do the same thing in the whole bear cohort in the future. So to start just presenting our own cohort, the IMA Granada cohort, we started in 2002, recruiting only male. This is the difference of the IMA cohort, Granada cohort comparing to the other Spanish cohort. We only have male. We started in 2000 and we have made several follow-up, as you can see, in 2005, in 2010, and 2029 was the last one when the children were already adolescents. During the different follow-up, we have reviewed many variables through questionnaire, and also we had recruited several biological samples, for example, placenta at bear, and urine and blood during the other one. To measure the effect biomarker, the BDNF, we decided to do in in fact, in 3 different levels of biological organization. In whole blood, we decided to measure methylation pattern of the BDNF gene at 3 different CPGs in the SOM4, because the methylation is more stable through the time, but also we measure protein level of DNA in serum sample, and also it's possible to measure protein level in urine sample. That assessment was less common in the literature, but we wanted to see if we could discover a good relationship or not in urine sample that, as you already know, urine sample are easily to recollect compared, for example, with blood with serum. Obviously,
Mariana, Señora Fernández, 2 minutes left, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, in order to measure the neuropsychological assessment, we use a normal and very known questionnaire, for example, the CBCL, to measure behavior. And in this cross-sectional study, as you can see, we had information of exposure biomarker, effect biomarker at different levels of organization, and also the outcome. When we want to see the relationship between the exposure to pesticides and the behavior, we could see that children higher exposure to some of the pesticides had higher behavioral problem, for example, social problem, throat problem, rule breaking behavioral problem, especially with some of the metabolites that we measure in the urine sample. When we see the relationship between the exposure biomarker and the effect biomarker, we also find a very good relationship, statistical and those depending relationship with BDNF protein in serum. And at the same time, we see relationship between the exposure biomarker and the fed biomarker in the methylation way. But we wanted to see instead the relationship between individual compounds. What is the relation between the mixture of chemical found in the urine sample with the behavioral problem of the male? Because we are exposed to many of them. And we do that using a specific and statistical tool, is the WQS tool. As you can see, the exposure to chemical were related with more problem among the participants, mainly some of them, because the main actor of the mixture were probably the core-proliferase compound and the pyrethroids compound that we measure in urine. And as you can see in this slide, moderate and higher serum protein level were also associated with, in an additive manner, with some of the problems that we found with individual compounds, mainly throat problem and rubrical behavior. And in the mediation analysis that we did, with the more important result, the IMP was mediated. The effect of the IMP effect through throat problem were mediated by the BDNF protein level in a 21.5% of the outcome measure. So in summary, we can say that we found an association between exposure to non-persistent pesticide and behavior problem among Spanish adolescent male that could be partially explained by the BDNF protein alteration, and a possible combined effect for some pesticides with more withdrawal, social and throat problem and higher BDNF DNA methylation percentage, especially in a specific CPG Iceland, as well as when the CPG total exposure was considered.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we're already.
No, that's minutes. Okay. That's okay.
Thank you. It is extremely interesting. Thank you so much for the very nice results, and it's also nice to see that the EU is supporting such important studies. We can stop the sharing mode now, and we will move on to our last speaker before the Q&A session. Please, as a reminder, do not hesitate to put additional questions in the chat. I'm writing them down. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Polixeni Nikolopoulou Stamati, or Neni in short. Neni is a medical doctor, a pathologist, has been studying the impact of environmental contamination by chemicals and public health. And she will talk to us about the impact of pesticides in urban areas on children's health. Neni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. And I just want to thank you for putting all this, organizing this excellent morning. And I would say that I would second already everything presented. And I would only, before I start presenting my very short presentation, I'm sorry, I cannot use my camera. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Okay. I just want to say that there are no safe levels of exposure, because I've been seeing in the chat eagerly asking for levels of exposure. And I must state here before I start anything, saying that there are no safe levels of exposure on this. And we must move from paracelsus to the biology, the new biology we know. And it was excellent, the presentation and the last presentation of Professor Mariana Fernández. I think it says everything, I mean, and before the other ones. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you, Natalia. So we have to think of a generation. Children are on the front line, and there's a pesticide actually generation, because everybody's exposed. and we really don't know and what is really happening, not only to the levels of exposure, but also to the interactions of levels of metabolites or whatever. Can I have the next one? Natalia, yes. Well, we know, so I will just somehow summarize the discussion today. This is what's happening now, is by disrupting, we know that they act by disrupting signaling mechanisms in the central nervous system, by inhibiting neurological function, by acting as endocrine disruptors. And there's evidence from animal studies and adult occupational poisoning that demonstrate that insecticides via similar neurotoxic mechanisms are following a high dose exposure. But less is known about the mechanisms of neurotoxicity at low level exposure that are relevant to the general population. Can I? Low level of pesticide exposure are an important concern in pregnant women and young children, of course, fetal and infant brains, and adding to the concerns of fetal exposure, pesticides are able to cross the placenta, which is a very, very crucial issue. And this, the fetus tends to have lower levels of detoxifying enzymes, so they cannot deal with the subject. So we have increased fetal susceptibility. Now, low levels of pesticides exposure during pregnancy or childhood have been found to be associated with neurodevelopment deficits such as lower IQ, disorders such as autism, and attention deficit disorders and perceived developmental disorders. And I have the second one. So it's an old story that is many times said. Children are at high risk. Organophosphate insecticides, chlorpyrifos, and certain pyrethroids are the registered pesticides most heavily applied in cities. Illegal street pesticides are also in use, including the carbamate also and methylparathione, which is something very much used here in Greece. Now, in New York State in 1997, the heaviest use of pesticides of all countries statewide was in the urban of Manhattan and Brooklyn. Can I have the next one, please? So this is something that comes because pesticides are very close to the ground and children are very close to the ground, so they have hands-to-mouth behavior. And the persistence of semi-volatile pesticides, such as chlorpyrifos, are on rugs, furniture, stuffed toys, and they absorb the surfaces with closed apartments anytime, in the air or anywhere. The compounding these risks of heavy exposures are that children's decreased ability to detoxify. They don't have the ability to detoxify like the ground-ups and to excrete pesticides because of the rapid growth, because of the development and the differentiation of vital organ systems. And these developmental immaturities create early windows of great vulnerability, what we call windows of exposure. So recent experimental data suggests that chlorpyrifos may be developmental neurotoxicant and that exposure in utero may cause biochemical and functional aberrations in fetal neurons, as well as deficits in number of neurons. Now, certain pyrethroids exert hormonal activity, of course, and they'll alter early neurological and reproductive development. Can I? So assays currently used for assessment of the toxicity of pesticides are insensitive and cannot accurately predict effects to children's exposure in utero or in early postnatal life. So protection of children, and particularly of inner city children, against the developmental hazards of pesticides require comprehensive strategy that monitors patterns of pesticides use on a continuing basis. So assess children's actual exposure to pesticides, use state-of-the-art developmental toxicity testing, and establish societal targets of reduction of pesticides use. Now, this is from information, this is from published information since 1999. Can I have the next slide, please? And we go to 2022. I think we're on the same spot, not very, somehow we have moved, but prenatal exposure to organopesticides and risk-taking behaviors in early adulthood are now examined, meaning that something is happening in the uterus into the fetus, which was not detected years before, and now we have started looking at it and trying to identify what is happening. Can I have the next one, please? So our major concern, and we have now, there's a lot of going in the reference literature, published literature, we have major concerns about the fetus and the child brain, which is more vulnerable to neurotoxic effects than adults. Of course, we have other also early happenings happening from early life exposure, like asthma, bronchitis, persistent cough in children that have been linked. All these have been linked to gestational exposure. And the respiratory effects of gestational exposure to pesticides are, of course, controversial. In every medical, let's say, study, we see in the end saying that more information is needed, more studies are needed, but this doesn't mean that things do not exist. And since they're published, let's say, in a very respectful journal, I mean, one should take it and think about it. Let's go to the other one. So I think that I'm repeating here because I heard through the all the representations of the why and mostly of Professor Fernández, why the development brain is particularly susceptible to neurotoxicity. Of course, we should focus a little bit on the blood-brain barrier that restricts, of course, we know restricts substances from blood to brain. Now, in its absence, toxic agents can freely enter the developing brain. So in summary, the developing brain is extremely vulnerable to toxic insults because a large number of processes occur during an extended period of time, first, and then because the blood-brain barrier is leaking. Can I have the next one? Is somehow there's a leak rendering the developing brain more vulnerable because it starts from the fetus life until also I think the third year or the first year or the second and the third year of age. So it is not mature, and it will lead, anything can pass from blood, can pass the barrier and can go to the brain, can enter the brain. When I was studying medicine, we were taught that this blood-brain barrier is a very strict barrier and nothing can pass through there. But now we know that there are molecules, and here we come also to this chat that was discussed. They said that what are the levels of exposure? Levels of exposure are not any, can act, let's say, with parts per billions in a biological basis. Can I have the second one, please? So we know now that we can identify some things. We heard also until this morning now, but there are certain patterns that are detected that have to be related to exposure in fetus. Can I have the other one, please? Move. Okay. So genetic and environmental factors work together to shape the early development. So there's not only one thing that we have here. We don't have only exposure. We have also the genetical factors that these gene environmental relations allow to each child to adapt to their surroundings and also to interact. So one is thought inheriting certain forms of genes can have many different interactions. So we can never say anything only about external exposure. We have to see what is happening also with interaction with our, I say, the map. We have our gene map that we have inherited since our birth. Can I have the second one? I'm going quickly because I know I have to go. So can I have the other one?
You still have 5 minutes, Lily.
Oh, I'm doing well then. So, then I would, if I would go, I didn't say anything about? Yes, okay. We have the epigenetics that have changed our understanding of how the environment interacts with our genes and how genes interact with the environment. So epigenetics is a very strong point, I mean, that we have to look at and to see what is happening, because epigenetics means that what is happening passes to next generation without even the generation be exposed to. And we have this, the DDT example. Please, next, Natalia, next. Yes. So low levels of exposure are crucial for pregnancy, during pregnancy. And prenatal exposure to multiple pesticides is associated also with auditory brainstem response at 9 months. And there's a cohort study here, interesting cohort study, for Chinese infants. Because there are not many studies, cohort studies, showing the exposure, intrauterine exposure, and late effects, happening. Can I have the second one? Okay. This is from, as you see, the baby is from India. It has a mark on his face. And they're talking about the acute poisoning, of course. It seems that in Europe, we are not very much, let's say, interested about the subjects, because maybe we don't have so much acute poisoning. But unfortunately, we have birth defects that we're not talking about. Congenital diseases, what we call them. We have cancer. We're looking about asthma, allergies, and immune system problems, and reproductive disorders, of course, there, and neurodevelopmental disorders. So also, we should be looking also for obesity, diabetes, and other metabolic disorders, because we must not forget that they're acting as endocrine disruptors, even in very low doses. I just want to thank you here, and open to this discussion, which is very, very interesting for me also. I've learned a lot this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neni, for this interesting presentation and the review of the scientific literature. When you were speaking about the blood-brain barrier, I was thinking of these two recent studies showing that there is presence of neonicotinoids in children's cerebrospinal fluids.
Yes.
And also studies showing that it's not only the blood-brain barrier, it's also the placental one. You also mentioned it, that in mice, the blood level of neonics in mice blood is the same as the one in fetuses. And when one knows that, contrary to what the pesticide industry was pretending, neonics interact with mammalian neurons, it is indeed very worrying to see that also the blood-brain barrier is leaky, as you say, until the age of 3. And now there starts to be publications with that regard. Okay, so now we will move on to the questions. You can still drop some questions in the chat if you like. Just one thing is, there will be, the presentations will be put online and shared with you after this this webinar. There was a question about if there was, I suppose, some kind of certificate of attendance. Usually we don't deliver this, but if any one of you need it, you can always send an email to Natalia, and we will make one for you. And then there were questions about the levels of contamination, both in a grass sample in South Tyrol and then in the air in Germany. So I suggest we start chronologically. Koen Hertogge, are you still there? Okay, Koen might have left, but as I also followed this study, I can address the answer. So the levels of pesticides you could find in the grass were regularly higher than the maximum residue limit in food. This is the only thing we can tell. Of course, nobody eats the grass. But as the other scientists presented this morning, it's a marker of exposure. It doesn't say that this is how high the risk is, but as also explained by, I think, two people, the evolution of science over the 20 last years is really showing that for a series of pesticides, including carcinogenic, mutagenic, genotoxic pesticides, and endocrine disruptors, there is no monotonic dose response, contrary to what Paracelsus was saying, and that no safe level can be no level can be considered safe. And this has also been included in the EU pesticide regulation, that humans cannot be exposed to any level of endocrine disruptors, carcinogenic, mutagenic, and chemicals that are toxic to reproduction. So these studies do not aim at quantifying the risk, but rather at highlighting the exposure. But then I can maybe give the floor to Alisa about the concentration in the air. Would you like to intervene on this?
Yeah, so I can say that we weren't actually able to measure concentrations, as this is not possible with passive air samplers. We measured some levels, but it's not possible to conclude on concentrations based on this, because the passive air samplers were placed over a long period of time, and we do not know the amount of air volume that went through them. However, the German Federal Office of Consumer Protection and Food Safety is actually currently planning to do an air monitoring with active air samplers. So they should be able to measure concentrations with that study. So we might know more on that once that study is concluded. And also there's no acceptable daily intake limit for inhalation of pesticides. There's only limits for the absorption of via the gastrointestinal tract, as I said earlier. And also there's no maximum residue limit for pesticides in the air. So because there's no research done on what pesticides in the air do to our body, there's not really any way to make statements about what this means for our health. But obviously we do know that endocrine disrupting chemicals can be very dangerous, even in small doses. And obviously we also can't neglect the effects that this pesticides in the air have on the environment and also on organic farmers whose fields might get contaminated by pesticides in the air.
Thank you, Alisa. I would just also add that when inhaling chemicals is also, well, from a biological point of view, might be much more dangerous for humans, because when you ingest food with pesticides or other chemicals, part of them are degraded by the liver directly after absorption by the gastrointestinal tract, which is not the case with lungs. You directly absorb them and it directly goes into your bloodstream, and this is not taken into account in the regulatory risk assessment. There was also a question still for you, Alisa, from WWF on the potential origin from these, I think, 30% banned pesticides that were found in the air.
Yeah, so again, we're not sure where they come from. So we assume that it is due to the persistence of a lot of pesticides. So obviously we know that DDT is known to be very persistent in the environment. So it might have been that those pesticides did get banned and a long time ago, but they are still in the air due to being very persistent. And also we have to say that our study was measured the long-range transport of pesticides. So it might have been that some of the substances that are banned in Germany are still allowed in other countries. And so they were still able to come in that way. And also the German Federal Office for Customer Protection and Food Safety released a report in 2021, and they actually found in some shops where they sell pesticides that 1/3 of the pesticides there sold in there were not approved anymore. They also control some farmers, but they only found around 6% of non-allowed substances by farmers. So it might be possible that there's still some people that use banned pesticides, but we think it's more likely that the substances banned are just still in the air due to being very persistent substances.
Yes, and there's also the issue of sales of illegal or counterfeit pesticides, for which we have, well, because it's illegal, very little documentation because it goes through parallel circuits. Thank you, Alisa. I see Professor Fernández, you wanted to add something?
Yes, because in the discussion, in addition to talk about exposure level, low or high level or safe level, threshold level, I didn't have enough time because the presentation was only 10 minutes, but as you can see, we were being able to find between 4 and 6 different metabolites in each individual. So we need to progress. It's difficult, but we need to progress in order to evaluate the risk to mixture of compound. And we are exposed to many pesticides at the same time, insecticide, fungicide, etc. So it's difficult to understand that question and to include that issue in the legal environment, but we cannot continue evaluating risk based on individual compound.
Yes, please write to your regulatory authorities and the Commission as well, because it is clearly a topic that is progressing very slowly. We then had a question, but I'm not sure I fully understand it, is why there would be less interest in research for the matters of that we're discussing today in Europe or in the US. Is it because we have many of the producers of pesticides are located in Europe? Well, I don't know if one of the panelists want to intervene on this. On our side, I would say that I don't think there is less interest. On the contrary, the population, from the citizens' point of view, there is a huge interest in terms of pesticides. We see it in regular polls, votations, and protests, and so on, since many years. And I think it's even more prominent since the issues of neonicotinoids and then glyphosate classified as carcinogenic or not. So I think there is a lot, and there's also more and more research funded by public authorities on the toxicity of pesticides and also on alternatives. But maybe if you want to clarify your question, Mr. Rosien, don't hesitate. Madam Fernández, did you want to add something?
Yeah, we cannot talk about that is a isolated problem in Europe or in USA. We are living in a global continent, in a global world. So it's crazy that in Europe are prohibit some of the compound that we sell to another part of the world, but we are consuming, for example, fruit from the other part of the other side of the world. So it's like a boomerang. So we cannot think that it's a problem of Asia, United States, or Europe. It's a problem of all of us, in my point of view.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, the thematic of export of EU banned pesticide is an important one. The Commission committed to help the export of EU banned pesticides. It needs to be pushed a bit, but it's progressing slowly, but it is progressing. Indeed, to be more coherent, it doesn't make sense to ban chlorpyrifos in the EU. and then to keep exporting and destroying the future of children in third countries. It is clearly immoral. Then the next question is to the city of Paris. You have a very strict laws on and penalties on people who would keep using synthetic chemical pesticides in Paris. It's yes, impressive. 150,000 euro fine, up to 6 months imprisonment. Has, to your knowledge, ever been any case of people using illegally pesticides and being sued?
Actually, to our knowledge, we don't have any examples to share about any enforcement of the law. It's much more to convince and to push people in the right way, we guess. Actually, that it's how it's supposed to work. I know that you can still, if you're an individual, you're not supposed to buy it or use it anymore in the law, but you can still buy it on eBay or some and some are like still using it, and it's much more complicated when you're a city because you're much more under everyone's eyes. So in Paris, it's not the case. We don't use the pesticides included in the law, prescribed by law, but we don't have any example, sorry, about maybe we can research it, but we don't have any examples.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is no more question in the chat. Does anyone from the panel want to add something? Is there any other question or comment? We still have a bit of time from the audience. We can open to oral questions or comments. No? Okay, so with that, yes, Natalia.
Sorry for the slow reaction. Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Polixeni about the impact of glyphosate on children's health. If you can tell us a little bit more about glyphosate.
Well, glyphosate is through oxidative stress. And actually the final point, the end point, let's say, of any of pesticides is through oxidative stress, which means that they entering in the organism, they produce the free radicals. The free radicals we know that are associated with cancer, with the degenerative diseases and all that. So glyphosate is known and it has been studied, and we know that it produces free radicals. So is this what you want to ask to me to say or something else? Because, well, glyphosate is everywhere. It's even in children, you know, in small children, it has, I think I see Professor Mariana Fernández, her hand. Maybe she has to say more about it.
In my opinion, we need to produce more human exposure data, because most of the data has been focusing in animal. Obviously, I totally agree with your answer that it's a very dangerous compound, but still there are a lot of controversy regarding the effect on human being. And in order to answer that question, we need to produce good data, human exposure data. We are in our group producing this kind of information. It's difficult to measure the low level in human sample. Try to relate with several adverse effect in a manner as I presented today, including not only effect by exposure biomarker, but also effect biomarker that we could understand the effect of glyphosate in human population.
Yes, thank you, Professor Hernandez. But it's excellent to have more information and to go through research. to more information. But I think now we have enough information to proceed in changing the laws and in, let's say, enforcing the legislation that will protect. We have totally forgotten about the precautionary principle. We're talking about more research and more research, yes, but we need also to implement the idea, let's say, if it cannot be otherwise, the idea of the precautionary principle. We have to have it in mind.
Totally agree with you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. But still, having more data on biomonitoring data will also help to make decisions to better protect certain categories of the population, and in particular children. Well, thank you, ladies, for these answers. Is there any other question? No? Okay, then I think we can conclude. So first, thank you very much to my colleague Natalia for putting this webinar together, to organizing it. I think it was very interesting. Thank you to all the panelists for the high level of your presentations, and sorry for pushing you to make sure we do not finish behind schedule. Thank you to the audience for your interest, your questions. I hope you are happy with the information you received. And I think today we had also all of us, at least the ones who are organizing Zoom meetings, a good lesson that we have really to make sure we filter correctly people who join. It's also a good lesson that we need to be more cautious. It's the first time that this arrives in a Pan-Europe webinar. And yes, I think the presentation we heard today really advocate for more protection of children's health. The history has shown us, I mentioned it with chlorpyrifos. It was also part of Ms. Fernández's presentation that we authorize for we are exposed for long periods of time, and then for a very, very long period of time, we after all this exposure, we realize that suddenly they have destroyed people's future. So clearly, as Dr. Nicolopoulou was saying, implementing better the precautionary principle and improving the risk assessment, risk management is something urgent. With that, I thank you again, everybody, for your presence, and I wish you a nice afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.